critical period where the Articles of Confederation led into the United States Constitution, right? These three compromises over, slavery and representation and the tariff, things like that, and that sort of set the stage for Bailey to launch the ship of the new state, as he says, right? So in 1789, George Washington is elected as our first president. He sets a lot of precedents. One precedent that he'll serve, or that he will initiate, is a two-term presidency. We didn't have a rule on the president can only serve 2 terms for years after Washington. But ever since Washington, every president kind of honored the tradition of retiring after 2 terms if he wasn't going to be reelected. So what do we call the president? King, Sir, Your Highness. He said, no, Mr. President is just fine. So a lot of the things that we still use today with the president were set up initially by George Washington. So what do we know about Washington? Well, he's not a Federalist, but a lot of things in Washington's presidency are sort of Federalist leaning, okay? Again, the 2 big parties early on are the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, also known as the Jeffersonians, also known as the Republicans, right? So it's the Federalists versus the DRs, the Democratic Republicans. Washington's really good at staying neutral. So when we think about these early presidents, I like to look at this history through 2 different lenses. Presidential history, so what's happening in Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and then what's happening inside the country and outside the country. So fancy word for that would be foreign and domestic affairs, inside and out. If you got those, you got what's going on. So in terms of foreign affairs, we're in the middle of a war between France and Britain during Washington's presidency. So Washington has to sort of maintain that neutrality. He brokers a couple different treaties with his cabinet. Jay's Treaty, which was the overseas rights for trade, especially with Great Britain. Pinckney's Treaty, after Charles Pinckney, was to buy the United States some time. We're going to trade with both France and Britain. Pinckney's Treaty also gave us the rights to use the Mississippi River for trading from Spain. Okay, so as it relates to foreign countries, those are a couple of treaties right away. Domestically, he's still trying to set up his cabinet. So Hamilton is his Secretary of Treasury. He's the money guy. Jefferson is the Secretary of State. He's the guy that negotiates with other countries. Henry Knox is the Secretary of War. They didn't call it Secretary of Defense back then, Secretary of War. It names an Attorney General. And one of the big issues during Washington's presidency was the country was expanding into native territory. So, any conflict with natives, the answer was always to just send the military. And we'll force those treaties with Native Americans at the hands of the military, but there were also some strong treaties that set up the nation. So one is the Treaty of Greenville, and that's where North American groups gave up the Ohio River Valley. When I say Ohio River Valley, I mean like Kentucky, Ohio, present-day Indiana. There was 2 big acts, the Land Ordinance of 1785, and then the big one was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And that divides up all of that territory like in your Big 10 states area, so like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. When you're in a plane sometimes and you go over that area, it just looks like a big quilt, right? It's like everything's perfectly boxed out in these parcels of land. It's not all roads. That's just how they parceled up different chunks of land, right? That came from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, that quilt that you see in an airplane. It also provided another way for a group of people living in a specific area to become a state. So, if you have 60,000 people, you can apply to the federal government to become a state. That's how eventually Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, once you got your 60K, you can apply to become a state, roughly the population of the Leiden area, so it doesn't seem like very much. Military still had to protect that new area, and some of those new areas were put to the test with the Whiskey Rebellion. 1793, we talked about Bacon's, right? We talk about Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. The Whiskey Rebellion is like the third of the big 3 rebellions early on, right? Western Pennsylvania farmers, they're tarring and feathering tax collectors. First true test of federal power. In theory, now that we have a constitution that has a stronger central government and provides the way for a military and taxing people, the idea is we should be able to shut this down. Washington is put to the test early in Pennsylvania with the Whiskey Rebellion, and he squashes it, sending in the army of 10,000 men to squash this rebellion. So Washington, here's your first test. Washington passes the first test, right? So this is sort of proof that the Constitution is working. Now, there's a whole backstory to the Whiskey Rebellion that, they took the tax away after that, so the farmers really won, and they lowered the tax and all that stuff. So really, in the end, they couldn't convict any of the people that were tarring and feathering the tax collectors because they had to be put on juries of people who would say, no, they're innocent, they didn't do that, right? Because they were neighbors, they weren't going to bust each other. So the people kind of feel like they won. But historically, we see the Whiskey Rebellion as a test of Washington, and then Washington passes that test. So we know from Washington's farewell address, he warns of sparring political parties. This will destroy us if you go into these two different factions. And again, he was pro-federalist, but historically Washington never really had a political party. So setting up everything for the first time. Adams, who was his vice president, will take over in 1796. Adams is your only Federalist president we've ever had. Federalist Party was strong at the time, but Adams was the only guy to break through and actually be elected. So historically, Adams gets a bum rap because of the Alien and Sedition Acts. One of the things the Federalists were really trying to do were protect Federalist interests and protect people that were in the country. They didn't want a ton of minorities coming in the country. They didn't want immigrants coming into the country. They didn't trust people who were from the outside and weren't a part of the revolution, right? That foundational American moment where we earn our independence. So Democratic Republicans were opposing them on the other side, but through the Alien and Sedition Acts, and you got to know this, here are the things that he said. It's going to take longer for you to become a citizen. So I want to say it was 5 years to become a U.S. citizen, and it went to 14. So you had to live here for 14 years to become a citizen. That was the alien part. Alien, not like space, outer space, but like foreigner. That's what they meant. Sedition Acts say that you can't criticize the government openly. Well, that seems to go against what amendment? Criticizing the government openly? The First Amendment, the right to free speech, right? Some people said that was illegal. And, again, he sets the laws to expire at the year 1800. Smart, because if he wasn't elected again, which he won't be, now you can criticize the government and anyone can come in. So he basically sets up the next president for failure by having the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire in 1800. Well, on the other side of the Alien and Sedition Acts are two guys, Jefferson and Madison. And they pen a couple laws called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And this is really important cause and effect in history. So cause of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are the Alien and Sedition Acts. They don't like it. And they say, you know what? The state of Virginia, where we're from, we don't like that law. We're going to nullify it, good word to use, right? We're going to cancel it. We're not going to follow it. And what that does is it lays the table and the foundation for the idea that a state can nullify a federal law. So can a state just decide if they don't want slavery? Right? I mean, those seeds are being dropped here, that idea of federalism, who has the power, the state or the federal government. Ultimately, who has the power? Well, in 1803, one of the top three most famous Supreme Court cases of all time that you're going to have to know for the test, Marbury versus Madison, says that the Supreme Court has the final say on whether or not something is constitutional or not, right? It's the concept of judicial review, 1803, Marbury versus Madison. So Madison sort of alienates his own party by not taking the side of the British during the foreign event. XYZ affair, if you remember the XYZ affair, the French wanted us to bribe them just to talk. We didn't know who they were. We called them tributes X, Y, and Z. And Adams defiantly states, millions for defense, right? Federalists want to spend on the military, but not 1 penny for bribery, not 1 penny for tribute. We will not be pushed around and bribed just to talk to you, French. So he never takes sides in that XYZ affair. Adams never goes to war. We didn't have a navy at the time. Probably a smart call, but the Federalists wanted more intervention during that time. So he kind of grows a bum rap with even his own party, even though Adams really was a brilliant guy. So let's talk about the Federalists. The father of the Federalist Party is really Alexander Hamilton, who's one of my favorite guys in history. Most of them were pro-federal government, strong central government. Most of them were from New England, so the wealthy merchant class were Federalist leaning. They supported Britain. The Federalists wanted a strong military, and they favored loose interpretation of the Constitution. So just because it doesn't say it explicitly in the Constitution doesn't mean we can. It kind of means that. Yeah, we can do that. They loved trade, and they were all backed by Hamilton's financial plan. And here's what was in that. Strong, large, protective tariff. The larger the tariff, the better it is for American business, right? We want to buy American goods, and we want to send American goods overseas and make some money. 2, on Hamilton's financial plan, create a national bank. But the Democratic Republicans say, well, wait, where does it say in the Constitution that we can create a national bank? We have small banks, we have local banks. And the Federalists say, this necessary and proper clause, it's necessary and proper for Congress to do this, so we should do this, right? Jefferson was against the bank. Later on, Andrew Jackson will try to kill the bank. But the Federalists want a large central agency for lending, right? When you need money, you go to the bank. I don't own my home. The bank technically does, right? A lot of people don't own their businesses. They need a loan from the bank. So how do you get the economy and money moving around? You have a strong central bank, right? So Hamilton's super in favor of that. And then 3, here's the brilliance of Alexander Hamilton, why I freaking love this guy. He says, all of the debts from the war, states, Massachusetts, Virginia, Georgia, all the money you spent on paying people, supplies, whatever, we will assume all of your debt. We will pay for all of your debt. The federal government will do that for you. And here's what Hamilton's thinking. If we assume the debts of the states, it will make the states feel indebted to the federal government, right? Like we own you, like you owe us, because we paid for all of those debts, right? Now, Massachusetts, where a ton of this war was fought, racked up a huge bill from the American Revolution. South Carolina, very little fighting down there, very little involvement, a lot of loyalists down there during the war, right? Has a very small bill. So South Carolina is like, well, who cares about them assuming we only owe $20. Massachusetts, they owe more than that. Massachusetts owes millions of dollars from the war, right? That's not fair. So one of the things that they did to sort of appease the southern states who didn't have these big bills was they said, all right, we'll move our capital city from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. And I don't think of Washington, D.C. as south, but Maryland and Virginia, in fact, are Chesapeake's southern territories, right? So they moved the federal capital in 1800 down south to Washington, D.C. as a compromise to kind of throw the southern states sort of a bone. It eased southern fears about this, and this was kind of cool. Philadelphia and New York were financial capitals of the United States. A lot of trading, a lot of business. Now we've got a political capital in D.C. and financial capital in New York and Philadelphia. Still is today, right? The NASDAQ, the Dow Jones, all the stock exchange, it's all in New York, right? So it was sort of separated. So those are some of your differences, Federalists, Democratic, Republicans. Now on the other side, you got the Democratic Republicans, right? Their guy is really Jefferson. Who do they favor? Farmers, Southerners. They like France, not Britain. They favor a strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it doesn't say it in the Constitution, you can't do it. So they were super against the bank, obviously. The 10th Amendment, right? They like states' rights and power to the people. So pretty much everything I just told you about the Federalists, just flip it. And that's what the Democratic Republicans were all about. So this two-party system continues through Adams' presidency. We know that Hamilton is killed by Aaron Burr in the famous duel of 1801, right? Now, Hamilton's death is not the death of the Federalist Party, but it was a huge blow. And following Adams and was the Revolution of 1800, right? So in 1800, we change power for the first time between one party to another. It happens now all the time, Democrats to Republicans and back and forth. But it's a peaceful change of power. Jefferson's elected president in 1800. There was a tie for presidency. It went to the Senate to vote for the 36th time. And in the background, Hamilton was actually swaying people towards Jefferson because he hated Burr even more than Jefferson. There's a famous Got Milk commercial about the famous duel. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, you got to YouTube it. It's really good. Got Milk, Hamilton, Burr. So, and Jefferson's very, very gracious. His first time speaking in his speech, he said, we're all Democratic Republicans. we're all Federalists, we're all going to come together and we're going to do this, but the next 24 years there's going to be Democrat and Republicans as president, right? And the Federalists kind of just like die out.